Power on.
The following is a presentation of the Sovryn Tech podcast feed.
It's Fighter Renegades, a Star Wars podcast.
Ooh, the man of tomorrow is here to talk some Star Wars, baby. And this is going to be another solo episode, not as in Solo the movie, though actually we will talk a little bit about Han Solo in this, even though you might not think it's related. But we have got another book review to get into, and you know, this, I want to be careful in saying this, and you need to pay really close attention to the words I am using, okay? Because I don't want you to confuse the term important with greatest. But this is probably, in the new canon, since Disney took over, this is easily the most important Star Wars book ever written. I mean, just flat out. Like, there is no other book. Like, if someone was to ask me, okay, what Star Wars book should I read if I wanted to start reading Star Wars books, or if there's just one that I should read, you know, to understand the movies and TV shows and whatever else better, what should I read? It would be this one. It would be Star Wars Shadow of the Sith by Adam Christopher. Now, again, hear me out, because while I am saying it is the most important book, I am not saying that Shadow of the Sith is the greatest Star Wars novel. In fact, that would, I mean, you know, it's kind of a subjective thing, and we could quibble a bit on what that would be. I think a lot of people would generally say something like Claudia Gray's Lost Stars, or even something like maybe Dark Disciple, or, you know, for me, it's been the Thrawn books, like especially the original trilogy of Thrawn books. And I don't mean the ones from the 90s. I mean, we're talking new canon here, because really just about anything that's new canon as far as extraneous material, you know, comics, novels, video games, whatever, all of them just pale in comparison to pre-Disney, what was being, you know, accomplished and done and written and put out there. That's, in my opinion, it's not even a matter of, like, that's not subjectivity, that's just a fact. And I imagine the sales numbers probably bear that out. Like, I gotta believe that Star Wars books and comics were far outselling what comes out today. Even though there are more Star Wars fans than ever, I rarely run into Star Wars fans that genuinely, like, read every comic book, that read every novel, you know, play every game, whatever. Like, that just doesn't seem to happen anymore. As to where in the 90s and even in the early aughts, that was incredibly common. Most Star Wars fans I talked to knew so much about, you know, like everything. And I'm not knocking new Star Wars fans at all, because also, admittedly, it's a lot easier to get digest versions, say, of what happens in the novels and comics and whatever else. For example, you know, you can go and watch like Star Wars Explained, or some of those, you know, some other YouTubers who break down all of the canonicity, you know, and changes and whatever else that happen within a lot of this material, and give you, like, maybe a brief overview of what happened. Or you can go to Wikipedia and find out what happened. So there's digest versions of, you know, all of this material, that maybe that's what a lot of people are going for. But admittedly, I see, while I think that's fine, and I respect that, because we all have the time that we have, and I mean, believe me, you know, I read literally everything Star Wars, and it just about takes up, like, you know, all of my time. Like, I rarely get to read any other kind of book or any other comic book or, you know, anything like that, because there's just so damn much. Is there too much? That's a separate conversation to have. My answer would be yes, but that's a separate and I can't believe I'm saying that. You know, the idea that there's too much Star Wars, because in the 90s, you know, like 13-year-old me would have started kicking my shins if I said that, if I said that to him. But, you know, it's where we're at right now. Anyway, all of this is to say that it's a pretty good bet that Disney is not, because even they've slowed down. Yeah, there's too much out there, but even they've slowed down on what they've been putting out there. Now it's a novel and maybe a full-size novel, if you're lucky, every 2-3 months. As to where before we were getting one at least every month, which was the pace that Star Wars had set, when LucasArts when George Lucas was still running it. Was you'd get like a major novel every month, and then who knows what else you'd get, as far as young adult or kids books or whatever. Certainly Disney's putting out a lot more of those, and that's their forte, and I get that. But yeah, I don't think the sales numbers are there, and certainly the same excitement isn't there. So anyway, all of this was me saying, no, the best Star Wars books in the new canon since Disney took over, and keep that in mind, it's new canon, like those old books don't count anymore, quote unquote. But in the new canon, yeah, this is, this is not the greatest book. It's a very good book. I dare say it might even be a great book, because there's a lot of cool shit in this that you would not get to experience it if you just took it in digest form. I want to make that clear. Okay, I still think it's important, at least for certain books, maybe not every one. Okay, like there's certainly some High Republic, I don't know, Edge of whatever that that's made for 8-year-olds. I still read it. Okay, and there's even an audiobook version of it, which is how I'm able to read it, partly. But you don't have to take that in, because you're probably not going to get like really cool shit in it. You're just getting adventures in Star Wars land. Is that new to Disney? No, this stuff was done with like kind of golden books and like those books on record and everything that, were the, Chewie and the Ewoks were doing something together and all that. I mean, it's not new for Star Wars. Okay. This kind of material has always been there, but yeah, certainly you can skip those. Okay. I get that. Unless you're a canon junkie, there's a lot out there that you can really skip. But this is one that I don't think should be skipped. Shadow of the Sith, which came out, let's see, that was end of June. So it was June 28th, I think, 2022. So this is a very new book. And it takes place between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. In fact, it's 17 years after Return of the Jedi. So this is well after The Mandalorian. Luke is an older guy. Okay, he's got the pepper beard, the whole thing. Lando's an older guy who is the other main character. The two main characters involved here, I mean, you get no Leia, no Han, nothing like that. The two main characters you're getting in this are Lando. I mean, R2-D2's around. But Lando and Luke are your main guys. Now, we knew, okay, that this was that there were stories like this out there. We knew this ahead of time. Why? Because when you play, particularly when you play like Battlefront 2, as in EA's newer Battlefront 2 with Iden Versio, we know that Luke and Lando went on some adventures. Hunting down varying like Force artifacts, whether Sith or Jedi. So the idea that Luke and Lando are working together, like that's not an odd pairing at all. In fact, it's a great one, just because they are such contrasted characters, even more so than like Han and Luke. Because Lando is such a scoundrel, as it were, even more so than Han, I think, that it really contrasts with more of Luke's kind of, for lack of a better term, because I hate this term, but lack of a better term, stoicism. Lando's ready to pour a drink and, has like all this really lavish, clothing and set up on the Lady Luck, which, by the way, the Lady Luck, which is from the original, Heir to the Empire, Timothy Zahn trilogy with Thrawn. The Lady Luck, I think the Lady Luck had been canon previously to this in Disney's new canon, but it's certainly canon now, and I definitely want to talk about some of the other things that get mentioned in this book that are now canon. But it makes for a very interesting contrast. So you're still, getting Luke, and let's just say it right out front. Luke is engaging in lightsaber battles in this, like kick-ass lightsaber battles. It really works, having just Luke and Lando being kind of the main characters here. So let's talk a little bit about Adam Christopher, who wrote the novel. This is not his first rodeo with Star Wars. In fact, he was originally supposed to write the original Mandalorian novel that was going to come out, like 2 years ago? That got canceled because Giussano, but, and I mean, it's because of Disney, being asses, but anyway, that I don't think it's unfair to say that even though the claim was that, well, no, we took Adam Christopher off the Mandalorian project because he's going to write Shadow of the Sith. Yeah, no, that's not how that worked. but that's the claim. Anyway, he also did short stories for both of the From a Certain Point of View short story collections. He had done End of Watch on the first one for A New Hope. The From a Certain Point of View books, if you remember, those are like the 40th anniversary novels or collections, short story collections. And because he also wrote The Witness for The Empire Strikes Back From a Certain Point of View collection. And both, fine stories. He had done some Tales from Wild Space for Star Wars Adventures. I mean, so, he's been around. And I think his writing was serviceable. The story was great. I have a very hard time believing, here's the thing with this story. And I'm not knocking Adam Christopher at all, okay, to be clear. He's a good writer. I'm not going to say he's a great writer. He's a good writer, okay? And what do I mean by that? Well, let me. Okay, so one of the challenges. Let's talk about that. Then I'll get into why I think Adam Christopher. This isn't his story at all. He was just a hired gun. One of the challenges in writing, and I say this as a writer, and I'm not a good writer, okay, but I know good writing. One of the challenges in writing is when you're writing fiction. And if you ever take writing courses and all this, and I mean, this has been true for decades. If you ever take writing courses or anything like that, usually a great teacher, writing teacher, will tell you, I want you to stop saying he said, she said. Use something other than said. Because the two most popular ways of ending off some characters talking in a novel, the way to end dialogue usually is he said or she said. Or if action follows what was just stated, a very common phrase used next, and it's probably the most common next to he said or she said, is and with that. And with that, they flew off into the stars or whatever, He uses with that way too much, and you keep hearing it, and it's so repetitive. I think that sort of thing can work in more juvenile writing, and I don't mean juvenile as an insult. I mean as in junior novels, or kids' books, like that. When you're using a more limited vocabulary, that's fine. But this is a major, full adult novel, so I expect a little more. But the with that's after you hear them a couple times, they just keep coming and they don't stop. It's annoying. So that's why I say I don't want to call him a great writer, but he does the job. Now, what job was he hired to do? Here's what he was hired to do. See, this book, Shadow of the Sith, I keep calling it Shadows, but Shadow of the Sith. This book is meant to, this is, in fact, I think I had heard Adam Christopher himself, or at least someone who was interviewing him, had said, this is Return of the Jedi, or this is like Star Wars 6.5, meaning this is the midway point between, this is literally being treated as the midway point between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. Now, that's kind of cool that the title of the book, in a way, it actually has the word shadow, because one of the greatest Star Wars novels ever written for the old canon, not the new canon, for the old canon, was the book that took place between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, that being Shadows of the Empire. So having Shadow of the Sith and it being the bridge between two major films, or two episodic films, episode 6 and episode 7, was, I don't think that was, I think that was intentional is my point. I think that was intentional. I don't think that was an accident. And kudos. I think that's cool that they did that, because they're paying homage, to one of the great Star Wars novels that's ever been written, that being Steve Perry's, again, Shadows of the Empire. So now in this, here's the thing. This is the book that we should have gotten before The Force Awakens came out. Instead, we got the horrendous Aftermath trilogy by Chuck Wendig. That made no sense because Chuck Wendig, and I'll empathize with him a little bit, Chuck Wendig effectively had to like write something that hinted at stuff that would be coming up in The Force Awakens and maybe beyond, but then also say nothing because, as we all know, for the sequel trilogy, 7, 8, and 9, Disney had no plan. So like Chuck Wendig couldn't like put down anything really concrete because clearly Ryan Johnson fucked up what J.J. Abrams was putting down in The Force Awakens with The Last Jedi, and then The Rise of Skywalker rewrote everything, which, I mean, and had no plan, and we know that. Why? Just, again, look at The Rise of Skywalker art book, which came out long after the movie was already out, and already out on home video at that. It came out like a year later. But that book had no artwork for the Emperor. So the Emperor was not part of the plan. That was a late edition. But it's the main crux of the fucking movie. So anyway, so I can empathize a little bit with Chuck. I mean, he's a goof, but I can empathize with him a little bit that he had a very hard writing task. Because he had to try and make compelling, Star Wars novels, which I don't think they were compelling. And it's not just because they're written in the first person, which I think sucks, but whatever, okay? So Adam Christopher here, okay, got to do what Chuck Wendig should have done with the Aftermath trilogy. This is a genuine bridge between Return of the Jedi and the events of The Force Awakens and really the entire sequel trilogy. And it does a good job of that, and this is something like Rob and I have talked about on other TIE Fighter Renegades episodes, that Disney over time can fix the sequel trilogy, not by re-editing them or anything, but by building up more backstory around everything that happens in those films and keeps them from just coming out of the blue and being shallow. And this is probably one of the better attempts at doing that. Though certainly The Mandalorian has already started doing that on the idea of Force clones with Force abilities and everything, all that's kind of getting led up to, in The Mandalorian, among other things. And, you get more of the Luke Skywalker that we wanted in the sequel trilogy in The Mandalorian. But Disney is clearly, they're in damage control mode, and they are working on repairing the clusterfuck that was the sequel trilogy. And this book does a pretty good job of helping out with that. Because before I talk about that, so that was Adam Christopher's job. And again, this is not an original story by Adam Christopher. Why? Because he had to, his mission was to make things that bridge the gap between, again, Return of the Jedi and Force Awakens, but also explains things further, revelations that occur throughout the sequel trilogy. So he wasn't hired to write an original story. He was hired to flesh out what's already there. This is, I always talk about how Star Wars is Jewish midrash, where it's explaining the odd things in Torah and Tanakh. Well, this is hardcore midrash because it's trying to explain so much of what ends up happening, especially in the sequel trilogy, because it doesn't address much really with Return of the Jedi. It's in between those two movies, yes, but it actually doesn't really touch on Return of the Jedi at all. So, it's more about fixing the sequel trilogy. And again, like I said, I think overall it did a pretty good job of it. The thing that for me probably keeps it from being a great book, I'll talk about what is really good about it, but I guess to get in the biggest negative is that half of the narrative is about Rey, as in Rey nobody, no, Rey Skywalker. It is about Rey as a 6 or 7 year old. And her parents, who we now know are, a failed clone of Palpatine, so a son of Palpatine, as it were, escaping from Exegol, and we do get, stuff on Exegol. And her mother, who is someone that he met when he ran off to some world when he finally got off of Exegol. That whole storyline around how they end up hiding Rey, and they do explain what why she's on Jakku, why she's under, Unkar Plot, and, what's the whole deal with that. All of that does get explained, but it's fucking boring. Like, I just don't care, And that's not to say that I don't care about Rey as a character. It's just, go forward. I don't give a shit about Rey's past. I don't give, the concept of her parents is frankly still a dumb idea. And this book didn't do that any favors, other than, yes, it did flesh it out, but it really didn't do it any favors. And all I wanted to do was, no, get back to Luke, get back to Lando, even though part of their mission is like trying to rescue this family. I just wanted to get into that. Talk more about Ochi of Bestoon and what he's doing and how he ends up with that fucking dagger that should not exist in The Rise of Skywalker, which they do an okay job of explaining that in this as well. That's all I wanted them to do. And like, there's this whole character within the book that is kind of like Darth Momin. They're really sort of the main. I mean, Ochi of Bestoon is kind of a villain here. And certainly, we already know a lot about Ochi of Bestoon through the comic books. If you're reading the present comic book series like Bounty Hunters, the Star Wars Volume 2, Darth Vader, all of those, and like you're reading about Crimson Reign and everything, like Ochi of Bestoon. We've gotten so much of that character, especially out of the Darth Vader comics, in the past couple of years. So I don't really need more, exposition on him. But he's there, and I mean, he's an annoying character, but I think he's designed to be annoying, and overall, it just kind of works. He's just pathetic, but then, again, he's pathetic by design. But anyway, the main villain, and it's really well done. You actually get the character of Kiza, who is one of the acolytes of Beyond, that basically only get described in the Aftermath novels, again, which, that idea, nobody ran with that idea in the sequel trilogy, even though when you're reading the Aftermath trilogy, back when before even The Force Awakens came out, you were like expecting, oh, what is this Acolytes Beyond? Ooh, what's this? And no payoff. But again, Disney had no fucking plan. But you do get, I mean, this is the other impressive thing with this book, is it does kind of close the loop on a lot of the weird shit that never got a payoff in Aftermath. Even if you don't exactly get a payoff, you do get closure, at least. But the character of Kiza is really cool. And, well, she ends up kind of like Darth Momin. If you know Darth Momin, he's that mask that, and there's a point I want to get into with this, but Momin is that mask that people can put on, like that's in Vader's castle, that was actually aboard the Emperor's ship at one point. If you read the probably still the best comic book series that Disney has done under the new canon, that being the Lando comic, the original Lando comic that came out back in, what was that, like 2015, something like that. Anyway, there's another character who was a Sith Lord. His name is Viceroy Exum Panchard, and you find out he ended up, he was able, like Momin, to like transfer his essence into a relic, in this case another mask. And Kiza, who Luke thought he had saved, she ends up like putting on this mask. But it's a really cool character. Like, she has her lightsaber and everything, her red lightsaber. That also has a lot of history to it. She ends up flying around in a TIE Defender, which is so cool for them to talk more about the TIE Defender. I'm kind of hoping that was Adam Christopher's edition, and he's like really a hardcore Star Wars fan. And like myself and like Rob and like many others, like one of Star Wars highlights was the game Star Wars TIE Fighter from 1994, which is what introduced everybody to the TIE Defender, which has been in canon since Star Wars Rebels in Disney's, new canon. But regardless, I thought that was really cool. That was one of the very cool aspects of this. But the villains, were awesome. I mean, Ochi of Bestoon, like I said, he's annoying and I don't really care. And he was more tied into the story arc around Rey and Rey's parents. So again, that bored the hell out of me. But you also got more of Pride, in this case, General Pride, or who would be Allegiant General Pride in Rise of Skywalker, which that was fun as well to get that inclusion. But just the story between Kiza, Luke, and Lando, even though that was tied into finding Rey's parents, ultimately, that was what was really rewarding and had its cool Star Wars moments to it. everything else was kind of boring. That's why I can't really call it a great book, but it is a good book, and it does do the job that it's meant to do. And this is kind of one of the overarching points I want to get into before I talk about some of the other, like positive aspects. Because really, the storyline with Rey and Rey's parents, that's the only thing that I just didn't care about. And I want to make this very clear. I'm not hating on the character of Rey. It's just, I'm all for having more Rey Skywalker, but give me Rey Skywalker 20 years after, Rise of Skywalker. Like, give me the Jedi leader Rey Skywalker, who doesn't have, who isn't fighting off all these varying problems or whatever, and is just out there kicking ass. And I am so on board with that. Okay, so I'm not throwing shade here at anybody, with Rey or involved with Rey or whatever. Just not. So anyway, so one of the things that really impressed me with this book is how many different media avenues it addressed. You get, again, correlation to Star Wars games. Again, all of these are canon. You get correlation, or you get connectivity, I should say. You get connective tissue with that because of Luke and Lando looking for relics and whatever. And this book, by the way, does set up where there's more stories to tell, and there's still plenty of years between this and The Force Awakens. So you get that. You also get connective tissue, again, with the Aftermath trilogy and many other Star Wars novels. So it pays attention to the fact that there's a lot, and it references much else in the novels. It also references the comic books regularly, especially, like I said, one of the greatest, if not the greatest comic that Disney has done with Star Wars, that being the Lando comic, where, Lando is talking about Darth Momin, and he directly references what happens aboard Palpatine's yacht when he broke into it, many years previous to the time frame of the novel Shadow of the Sith. And of course, there's reference to a billion things that happen within, or that end up happening in the sequel trilogy, and it fleshes all of that out. So if you want a book that tries to make more sense out of the sequel trilogy, I mean, this is why I say it's the most important book Disney has put out for Star Wars, because it is the book that makes sense of all of this bullshit that they made, and I want to say overall it succeeds in that. And that's part of what makes it such a good book. So it is the most important book. Again, that doesn't mean it's the greatest. It's not even close. It's just the most important one to get everything that's going on, in the sequel trilogy. And I hope Disney keeps doing this, where, they do continue to flesh out things that happen in the sequel trilogy so that those movies can be rewatched in 20 years and they have more weight. And it's things that make sense, and that, there's a ton of story around, this event and that event and whatever. That's not the way storytelling, in my opinion, should be done, but it's what we're left with. And if you still enjoy a lot of what's happening in Star Wars, and as I've said in previous, even very recent TIE Fighter Renegades, especially with the comic books, there's awesome shit going on. There's still new Star Wars to love, make no mistake. I'm not saying all of it's great, but there's plenty of it that is. Then this is something that I think is worthwhile. Now, I mean, let's talk a bit about the, about the positives within this book. One thing that this book did really well, or that I enjoyed that this book did, is Ochi of Bestoon, as well as Exum Panshard, who's, the Sith Lord in the mask, both either directly in the case of Ochi or indirectly more in the case of Panshard, address that the ability to heal is, because I've laid out this theory for years, ever since even before Rise of Skywalker came out. When that episode where Grogu heals Carl Weathers' character in The Mandalorian, I brought up this theory that healing is actually a dark side power. It's not a light side power. Like that transference of life essence to heal another creature, like Rey does with that snake in Rise of Skywalker, that is a dark side power. And this book seems to directly state that. Ochi seems to directly state it, and of course Panchard is trying to come back, after centuries, come back into the living, which kind of hints at, because his whole goal is he's trying to get to Exegol. I mean, both Ochi and Panchard are trying to get to Exegol, and they're trying to find it. and Panchard thinking he can be resurrected on Exegol, that's foreshadowing, no pun intended, of what Palpatine is doing there. And so that works. Like that's cool. That these are villains that have, and we know Ochi knows about Exegol, okay, and the seat of power that it is. Like, we have villains here with actually great motives, which is exceptionally rare even in Star Wars, or even in Disney Star Wars. So I like that a lot. I like that confirmation that, again, that healing, that the sharing of life essence is not a light side power, it's a dark side power. It's a Sith ability. And which, we should have known that. Again, I think that's been directly stated anyway, even in what's still considered canon, of course, with Episode 3, with what Darth Plagueis did and was. But then also, again, in the old canon, in the old EU, with Shadows of the Empire, not Shadows of Sith, but Shadows of the Empire, where Vader is able to heal himself with the dark side. But then, once he's healed, he's happy, and so he loses it. Because he starts accessing the light side instead of the dark side. So my theory stands tall, and I'm pretty sure I'm the first person to lay out that theory. And again, it comes directly from Shadows of the Sith, even though that wasn't considered canon at the time that I first brought it up. But yeah, we get some more of Exegol. I'll admit, there's some greater explanation and extrapolation on what the Sith can do and are, but nobody's really building up more about Exegol, and that needs to happen. If there's another point where this book failed, it's there. Even though you do get more of Exegol, you don't get more that we need to really understand what the fuck we're seeing in Rise of Skywalker. And I would have loved that. But there's plenty of direct references to the Sith Eternal and what they're doing, and it works in that sense. But it's still kind of shallow, kind of superficial in what they explore with that, other than they explain how important the planet is, but that's really about all you get from it. And some of the things also, real quick, that they did talk about with Exegol, I do still think, prediction on my part, they're eventually going to bring back Kylo Ren. That character is going to make a comeback, and they're going to say that he fell into a vergence and he came back, I don't know, with the world between worlds, or that Exegol healed him, whatever. However that ends up, kind of happening. Speaking of Exegol, though, they do directly discuss the Wayfinders, and the Wayfinders are, Luke straight up says this, that the Wayfinders were the precursor technology to the holocrons, which is interesting because that's kind of hinting at that the Sith invented the holocrons, even though the Jedi would end up taking such great advantage of them. So, props to the Sith there. But a lot of people, when Rise of Skywalker came out, why are you doing Wayfinders? Why not just say it's, a holocron? Well, for one thing, J.J. Abrams wants the exclusive marketing, toy marketing rights to anything. And so that's why everything gets renamed in the sequel trilogy, even though it looks exactly like shit that came before in Star Wars. But in this case, this was a clever explanation of why Wayfinders and holocrons are so similar, because one technology came before the other. So that worked for me. Then, yeah, I already mentioned earlier, Kiza's TIE Defender, I thought that was there was no reason to bring that into the book. So it's just pure cool factor, and it works, and I love it. And there was a lot of talk of Darth Momin. I thought that, basically Exum Panchard kind of following the same notes with, vesting himself into a relic, or downloading his consciousness, as it were, not in a technological term, but in a Sith way, into this mask. It was copying the same beats as Momin, but they referenced Momin. They didn't ignore the fact that how similar it is. And I think that works. And also, that might have been a way for Adam Christopher to essentially say, hey, I'm not making up a new Force ability here. This is something that was already set in the canon. And if that's why he did it, okay, I can get behind that, because that's a complaint. And usually these Star Wars fans are idiots. I'm sorry, they're wrong. When they say that something that happened in the sequel trilogy, oh, that's a new Force ability. That didn't exist before. That's not true. Most of the time you can directly reference even into the old EU where this idea came from. It's part of the problem, actually. It's the problem is actually the reverse of what most people are complaining about. It's not that Disney's introducing new shit. It's that they're bringing in old shit and not giving credit where it's due, which that's Disney's MO forever, right? I mean, even with their animated films in the 50s, and, you know, they never gave credit to the actual writers that they were lifting and bastardizing their stories from. You know, Snow White, whatever. But anyway, so yeah, and it was cool. Like I mentioned, Lando has the Lady Luck. You know, he's not using the Falcon. Of course, that makes sense. But Lando's rocking the Lady Luck. That's nice. And it was described exactly as it was in the Heir to the Empire trilogy. So I thought that was, you know, that was cool. You know, the lightsaber, Darth Noctis's lightsaber, Darth Noctis's lightsaber, and kind of the explanations around the Acolytes of the Beyond. Like, it was cool to finally get some understanding of what the fuck were the Acolytes of the Beyond. At the same time, it was kind of a write-off. Like, it's like, okay, yeah, they were a thing, but they were stupid. I mean, and that's exactly what they say, is that they were stupid and childish. And that they didn't know what they were messing with as far as the Sith goes. But, I don't know, that comes off kind of weak. But at the same time, I'm glad to get some explanation of what the hell that was. But it also gets closure with what ends up happening to the character of Kiza, who, again, was a part of the Acolytes of the Beyond. But again, a lot of downplaying on that, which I get it that they needed to do it. Another thing that they pulled from the old EU that I like this. They brought in the Corporate Sector Authority. Now, the Corporate Sector Authority, you've got to go way back, even before the Heir to the Empire trilogy in the 90s when Star Wars was making a comeback in fiction. You've got to go back to the original Brian Daley Han Solo novels from the 80s. You know, like Han Solo at Star's End. And in that, one of the people he had to deal with, or one of the groups he had to deal with, was the Corporate Sector Authority, which was like this, you know, like capitalist, you know, power player group in the Star Wars galaxy. And they brought them in. And now Lando's dealing with them in this case. And this is why I said, it's like, even though you might not think this book has to do with Han Solo, indirectly it does. It really worked to have the Corporate Sector Authority here, and that's actually who Pride, I think he's a colonel at this point, is a part of the group. If you remember, also, like, the Corporate Sector Authority were also described in Rebel Dawn, which Rebel Dawn was there's the Brian Daley Han Solo trilogy from the 80s, but then there was like a Han Solo trilogy that was like an origin story that came out by A.C. Crispin in the in the 90s. 3 of the best Star Wars books ever written. I mean, they're really great. They're not canon anymore. I wish they were, but they're phenomenal. And in Rebel Dawn, like the Corporate Sector Authority are in that, which at the time it was cool to have that because it was referencing books from, 10, 15 years previous. Now it's great, to have like this practically 40-year history, essentially get referenced in this book. So bringing in the Corporate Sector Authority, I thought was a nice touch. Definitely appeasing really, really long-time Star Wars fans because they're the only ones that would know about that. I mean, they even called it like the troops the Espos, which is exactly what they're called in the Brian Daley Han Solo books. So that was cool. Lot of canon stuff, to really dig into this. Again, the book was really here to make sense of the sequel trilogy and to try and bring together what I think were ultimately disparate threads that were getting set up in Disney comics, Disney Star Wars comics, Disney Star Wars novels, and even Disney Star Wars games that never got their payoff because, again, Disney had no plan. Even though you had a lot of people laying groundwork based on whatever notes they were, fortunately given, even though those notebooks probably got thrown away by Ryan Johnson. So, yeah, that makes it like I think that ultimately makes this this is a nexus of a book. This is a focal point of a book. And it'll probably go down as perhaps, in 20 years when there's a bunch of other books that are explaining everything that happened with the sequel trilogy that made no sense when it came out. Or, we're getting more stories and people just kind of forget the sequel trilogy as just being, oh, well, those were nice origin stories for these characters like Finn and Poe and Rey. Outside of that, this is a book that's going to stand up as like a must read for, I think, many, many years. because again, it does bring everything together and it makes sense of all this weird shit. In fact, it does a pretty good job of kind of rehashing some of the loose ends described in the Aftermath trilogy. I don't think you ever need to read the Aftermath trilogy. I mean, they're horrible books to begin with, but like anything that's going to actually, because again, a lot of people were reading the Aftermath trilogy looking for clues of what they were going to find out in the sequel trilogy. And that didn't happen. Not really. There was nothing really said that made any sense, as to where this is a book that you could read, say, before you saw the sequel trilogy, and suddenly the sequel trilogy would make a ton of sense. Or at least more sense than it does. So that's what puts it as the most important Star Wars novel written to date. Could that change in the future? Sure. But right now, that's my opinion on it. Again, it's not a great novel, but it's a good one. You get some awesome action, some awesome lightsaber action, some awesome starfighter action. You get lots of great action. Okay, you get lots of what makes Star Wars great in it. But then there's also plenty of flaws, and stuff that's just flat out boring within it. So that's why I call it a good book, but it is the most important book. So Shadow of the Sith by Adam Christopher, very fresh. Just came out. Man, again, this should have been the book that came out in 2013. This should have been the book. It couldn't have come out then because, again, there's no plan. But it should have been the book. But we've got it now, so go ahead and enjoy it. It has my recommendation. If you want other Star Wars novels to check out, you can email me or get in touch with me through varying ways, available through TIE Fighter Renegades. And I'd be happy to do a list of like the books that you should read that I think that are kind of essential and that are at least enjoyable in a Star Wars sense. But a lot of people are probably just taking in Star Wars again in digest format now, which is both understandable and partly a shame. But again, I get it. But if you do want to read a book, Shadow of the Sith is one to go for. That's it for this review from TIE Fighter Renegades. It went a little long, but there's a lot to get into here because this book was covering a lot of ground. So we had to cover a lot of ground. And I'll be back. Again, we got Andor coming out, all kinds of, exciting Star Wars stuff to be coming out soon. And we'll be here at TIE Fighter Renegades to review that. And I will see all of you, on the other side.